This week, we're going to go back to where we were 2 weeks ago and return to looking at the significance of events that happened in the town of Capernaum, the town where the adult Jesus lived. And if you've been here over recent weeks or you know the stories from the Bible, we've looked so far at the time when the man was lowered on a stretcher through the roof of a house, maybe even a house where Jesus was living himself. And Jesus healed this man. And then we also looked at his healing of a man with an impure spirit, which took place in the synagogue in Capernaum. So directly after this event that we looked at a couple of weeks ago of this man in the synagogue being healed by Jesus, we're going to have a look at what Jesus did next in Capernaum. So our reading for today is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, and have a look at this.
As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was.
So, whilst in Capernaum then, as we saw, Jesus goes to the house of two of his disciples, Peter and Andrew, although he's called Simon in this part of the Bible before Jesus gave him his new nickname of Peter a few months later. In this house, though, as we saw, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law of a fever she was suffering from. Now, not only does the fact that Peter's got a mother-in-law tell us that Peter himself was married, which in itself, I think, is an interesting thought in terms of Peter's life as a disciple, how that fitted in to his family life. But it also, I think, underlines the way in which, in Jesus' time, extended families would often live in kind of extended homes, clan dwellings, we might call them. We saw this image a few weeks back, but homes a bit like this, where Peter would have lived perhaps with his parents, certainly his mother-in-law we know about, along with his wife maybe. And in Jesus' time, you'd get a small house initially, maybe a small room, and that would expand. New rooms would be built on it as time went on and as generations were added to a family. New rooms were added and built adjacent to those ones, often around a small central courtyard as well. And so it seems it's in Peter and Andrew's house that later that same evening, after Jesus has healed Peter's mother-in-law, all sorts of other people visit Jesus there as well. Indeed, we're told the whole town gathered at the door. And in turn, Jesus healed many who had diseases. Now, if you go to Capernaum today, the site of the remains of the time of Jesus is dominated by this building at the top there, which kind of looks like a Bond villain lair or something up there. But it's actually a pretty modern church, about 35 years old. And it's a church which is built on stilts, effectively, because of what lies underneath it. And underneath it, well, here's a photo of what it was before the modern church was built over it. You've got 3 octagonal walls there, one inside the other. And what we're looking at is a bird's eye view of the remaining ruins of a 5th century church in Capernaum, which those octagonal walls are sort of base walls of it. It's reckoned it would have looked a bit like that perhaps in the 5th century or so. That's a cutaway version of it. Now, the interesting thing is that early churches were often built on sites where something significant had happened. They wanted to mark that place with a church building. And this octagonal church in Capernaum it's no exception. See, archaeologists have discovered that this octagonal 5th century church is in fact built over the remains of a much simpler, earlier church building. So the darker stones you can see there, they're actually the remains of a house-sized church, which even has early graffiti scratched into the walls. So they've taken some of that away now into museums and so on, but there were loads of symbols of crosses that were scratched into the plasterwork, even sort of phrases in Greek and Hebrew like Christ have mercy or Lord Jesus Christ help your servant, scratched into the walls of this very early house-sized church. So you've got a modern church, that one on stilts, built over a 5th century church, the octagonal one, built over a much earlier church from maybe the late 1st, early 2nd century. Now, why all these churches, though, on this particular site? Why this early graffiti, maybe? Well, it's because it's highly likely that this very early 1st century house church was originally the family home of Peter and Andrew. Indeed, an early pilgrim in the 4th century by the name of Egeria wrote that in Capernaum, the house of the chief of the apostles, that's Peter, has been turned into a church. And it stands to reason, I think, really, that early Christians would want to meet in a place where they knew, because the stories have been passed down to them, that this spot was the exact spot where Jesus healed people. He healed Jesus' mother-in-law here, and the whole town came to him here, it seems, to be healed in their own way. But more than that, given that Jesus himself lived in Capernaum, if the church that's been built there was over Peter and Andrew's home, I guess we could ask, why wasn't Jesus' home the place where these early Christians met as a church? That would make more sense, it seems. And it strikes me, perhaps, that it's one and the same place. Perhaps Jesus lived in this extended dwelling of Peter and Andrew's home. Perhaps that's why everyone knew where they could find him that same evening in order to be healed by him. So perhaps Peter's family home was actually the place where Jesus was living, and perhaps that was where this guy was let down through the roof, where again we're told everyone had gathered outside the door, meaning the only way to get to Jesus was through the roof. And if that's true, I think it's no wonder that this spot became a church, and it still is to this day. You know, a meeting place for the first Christians and one of the very first churches in the world, because it was probably the home of Jesus himself. Now, if that's all true, what difference might that make, knowing that, to us? Well, 3 quick conclusions perhaps to this. I think first, as with everything in Capernaum, Jesus' healing of Peter's mother-in-law and all those other folks from the town, it grounds us in the fact that Jesus was living a real life in a real town with real people. And that should give us confidence today that Jesus understands and identifies with everything that we've got going on in our real lives as real people in our real town. And he longs to bring us that same sense of hope and healing today. Secondly, though, I think it's clear from this that people knew where to find Jesus. He wasn't hiding away. They knew where to get to, where he was living. He was open and available to them. And so I wonder how we might follow Jesus' example by letting people know how they too might find or encounter God in their lives, you know, through how we live, what we share, through how we love them. So when people are in need, perhaps the encouragement is for us to do our best to make sure that they see us and our church as somewhere to come, not just for a warm welcome, but for deeper than that, perhaps more for help and support and love. They know where to find God because they know where to find us. And then thirdly, finally, I think, if indeed Jesus lived at the extended home of Peter and Andrew, which seems to me likely, then what a privilege it would have been for these brothers to have had Jesus as a housemate, as a flatmate, living with them. That hospitality that they would have shown Jesus. There's an encouragement for us to show that for people today, to welcome people as if we're welcoming Jesus himself. Hospitality ideally shapes everything we do, and I know the teams each week at Drop-In are fantastic at offering a warm welcome to people. Wouldn't it be great if the same welcome that people can receive at places like this, if we could enlarge that so that that became perhaps our national welcome for people who were striving to seek a new home from other countries with us. So on one level, I think Capernaum, that's the bird's eye view of all the remains that they've uncovered. It's simply an archaeological site, really, which reminds us in a historical way of the life and times of Jesus. But on a deeper level, I'd say, it still stands today as a testimony to Jesus's loving presence with us in real life as real people in a real town. And holding that thought, we'll look at another event from Capernaum next week.